In the gleaming halls of the Thalian Empire, a secret simmered beneath the polished surfaces and whispered behind every corner. Princess Alara, beloved daughter of King Valoran, had committed the gravest of offenses, one that not even her royal status could shield her from. Her crime was simple yet unforgivable. She had fallen in love with a human. Alara, a figure of grace and elegance, had long captivated the hearts of her people with her compassion and strength. But it was during a diplomatic summit with the Earth Coalition that her life took a turn that no one could have predicted. Amid the formality and politics of interspecies negotiations, Alara had met Daniel Kane, a human diplomat. Their connection had been instant and undeniable, a spark in a galaxy too often torn by division and conflict. Despite the dangers, they had pursued a love that transcended the rigid boundaries of their societies. They kept their affair hidden, knowing full well the consequences of their union. For the Thalian people, humans were a species to be tolerated, but never truly accepted. Their cultures, values, and even biology were seen as incompatible with the high standards of Thalian purity. But love, as Alara had learned, cared little for the rules of empires. Their secret romance unfolded under the cover of darkness, in hidden gardens and private chambers. The days were filled with tense diplomacy, but the nights belonged to them, where every stolen glance and whispered word only deepened their bond. Then came the revelation that neither of them had prepared for. Alara was pregnant. It had been a moment of both joy and fear. They had dreamed of a future together, one where their child could symbolize a new beginning for both their species. But reality soon shattered that dream. The pregnancy was discovered by the Empire's medical staff during a routine examination, and the truth quickly reached the ears of King Valoran. Alara had barely had time to react before she was summoned to the throne room, her father's cold eyes locking onto her with a fury she had never seen before. "You have betrayed your bloodline," Valoran hissed, his voice trembling with anger. "You have endangered the Empire with your reckless actions." Alara stood tall, her hands protectively resting on her stomach. "I have done nothing but follow my heart. This child is not a threat. It is a chance for our people to understand that we are not so different." Her words only enraged Valoran further. "You have been blinded by weakness, by human lies. This abomination will not be allowed to see the light of day. You will be imprisoned until this stain on our legacy is erased." Before she could protest, before she could explain or beg for mercy, Valoran ordered her imprisonment. The guards, once her loyal protectors, turned their backs on her as she was dragged from the palace. The grand halls she had once walked freely now felt like a distant memory, and the hope she had carried for her future was smothered beneath the weight of betrayal. Imprisoned in the darkest dungeons of the citadel, Alara was left alone, her only companion the growing life inside her. Every day she feared for the safety of her unborn child, knowing that her father would stop at nothing to erase the mistake she had made. And yet, even in the suffocating darkness, Alara clung to one fragile hope, that somewhere, someone would come for her. Light years away, Sergeant Max Ryland sat in the crowded bar of an Earth Coalition outpost, nursing a drink while trying to ignore the constant buzz of comms and negotiations happening around him. It had been weeks since his last mission, and his days had been filled with little more than routine security patrols and paperwork. The mundane work kept him occupied, but his thoughts often drifted elsewhere. Back to Thalia, and to Princess Alara. He had first laid eyes on her during a joint Earth-Thalian summit held at the heart of the Empire. As part of the Coalition's diplomatic security detail, Max had been stationed to ensure the safety of both human and Thalian dignitaries. He had seen Alara from a distance, her presence commanding every room she entered with an effortless grace. But it wasn't just her beauty that captivated him. It was the quiet strength she exuded, the way she spoke about peace and unity between their people. Max had admired her from afar, never daring to dream that someone like her could notice a soldier like him. And yet, when news broke of her imprisonment for her relationship with a human, it had struck him like a physical blow. The more he learned of her plight, the more it stirred something deep within him, an overwhelming need to act. He had overheard snippets of conversations, rumors spreading like wildfire through the diplomatic channels. Princess Alara, pregnant with a human child, imprisoned by her own father. The Earth Coalition's response had been predictably muted. They didn't want to risk their fragile alliance with the Thalian Empire, and thus, Alara's fate was left in the hands of those who viewed her as a traitor. Max had seen enough politics and diplomacy to know that no one would come for her. No one but him. The decision came to him in a moment of clarity. He couldn't let Alara suffer in that prison, awaiting a cruel fate for the crime of love. She had risked everything for a future where humans and Thalians could coexist, and Max knew, without a doubt, that he had to risk everything for her. He downed his drink, set the glass on the bar, and stood with a new sense of purpose. He would save her, no matter the cost. Max returned to his quarters and began to plan. It wouldn't be easy. Breaking into the Citadel, the most heavily fortified structure in the Thalian Empire, was a near-impossible task. But Max had faced impossible odds before. He was a soldier, trained to adapt and survive, and this mission, this rescue, was more important than any battle he had ever fought. In the dead of night, Max gathered what few allies he could trust, a small group of soldiers and engineers who shared his belief in Alara's cause. They swore an oath to help him, despite the risk. If they were caught, it would mean death or worse. But loyalty and love were more powerful than fear. With the Nebula Hawk, a small but fast stealth ship, Max and his team set off for Thalia. Every mile closer to the Empire's capital made the danger more real, but Max's resolve never wavered. Alara's life and the life of her unborn child depended on him. "We'll get her out," Max said to his team as the Citadel came into view on the ship's scanners. "No matter what happens, we don't leave without the princess." And with that, the rescue began. The cold, unyielding stone walls of the Citadel's dungeon pressed in on Princess Alara from all sides. Every day, the air seemed heavier, the darkness more suffocating. The once vibrant glow of her skin had dimmed, her energy drained by the constant isolation and fear. But no matter how bleak her surroundings, she never stopped thinking about her child. A child that represented love, hope, and everything the galaxy was trying to crush. She sat against the wall, one hand resting protectively on her rounded belly. The soft movements of the baby within her were the only reminders of life, the only thing that kept her fighting. She whispered to the child, promises of safety, dreams of a future where they could be free. But her heart was heavy with doubt. Each day, Alara endured cruel interrogations from the Thalian guards. They demanded information about her relationship with the human diplomat, hoping to extract some kind of leverage against the Earth Coalition. But more than that, they tortured her mentally, breaking down her defenses with cutting words about the abomination growing inside her. "We're doing this to save you," one guard had sneered during a particularly brutal session. "A half-human child? It's a disgrace. Your father wants to cleanse the bloodline." But no matter what they said, no matter how much they tried to strip away her hope, Alara remained defiant. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Even though her heart ached, even though every moment felt like a battle, she clung to the belief that she wasn't entirely alone. Somewhere, someone had to care. Somewhere, someone had to be coming for her. Still, as the days blurred together, even that fragile hope began to waver. The guards grew more vicious, and the days felt longer. Each night, she curled into herself, whispering to her child, telling them that they would make it through this. And then one night, everything changed. Alara was startled awake by a soft sound, something different from the usual noises of the dungeon. She sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear. Was it her imagination? The distant clank of a door echoed down the corridor, followed by the faint, deliberate footsteps. There was something different about this, something urgent. Her cell door, previously cold and unyielding, slid open with a barely audible hiss. A figure stood in the doorway, cloaked in the shadows, their face obscured. Alara's pulse quickened, fear and hope warring within her. Then the figure stepped forward and her heart nearly stopped. "Max?" she whispered, her voice a mixture of disbelief and relief. Sergeant Max Ryland stepped fully into the dim light, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that sent a surge of warmth through her. He looked different. His uniform darkened for stealth, his usual easygoing expression replaced with one of grim determination, but there was no mistaking the man who now stood before her. "Yes, Alara," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm here to get you out." Alara's breath caught in her throat as tears welled up in her eyes. For a moment she couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the sight of him, the man she hadn't thought would ever come. "How? How did you?" Max shook his head, cutting her off. "We don't have time for explanations. We need to go now." He stepped toward her, his eyes softening as he glanced at her swollen belly. "Are you all right? Can you walk?" I think so," Alara said, struggling to her feet. Her body was weak from the months of imprisonment, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins gave her the strength she needed. Max moved to support her, his strong arm around her waist as she steadied herself. "We have a ship waiting," he said, his voice full of urgency. "But we need to move fast. Once they realize you're gone, they'll send everything they've got to stop us." Alara nodded, her heart pounding with both fear and hope. She hadn't allowed herself to dream of this moment, hadn't dared to believe that someone would risk their life to save her. But here, Max was, standing before her, ready to do whatever it took. She took one final look at the cold, oppressive cell that had been her prison for so long, and then, with Max by her side, she stepped out into the dim corridor, leaving the darkness behind. The narrow corridors of the Citadel were a maze of shadows and steel, every turn another opportunity for danger. Max led Alara through the darkened halls, his blaster drawn, his body tense with readiness. His team, scattered throughout the facility, was working to disable the alarms and keep the guards distracted, buying them precious minutes to make their escape. Alara's breath came in shallow bursts as they moved swiftly, her body still weakened from months of mistreatment. But with every step she took, she felt a sense of strength returning, not just from the physical support Max offered, but from the knowledge that she wasn't alone anymore. She was no longer just a prisoner, she was someone worth fighting for. Max glanced at her as they reached a junction, his eyes scanning the corridors ahead. "We're almost to the hangar," he whispered, "but we're going to have to move fast once we're out in the open." Alara nodded, gripping his arm for balance. "I'm ready." Suddenly, the distant sound of voices echoed down the corridor. Max tensed, motioning for Alara to stay close as he peered around the corner. A squad of Thalian guards was approaching, their boots clanging against the metal floor. There was no time to hide. Max acted quickly, his instincts taking over. He raised his blaster and fired, the shots landing with precise accuracy. 2 guards dropped instantly, but the others scattered, calling for reinforcements as they returned fire. Max cursed under his breath as he shielded Alara, leading her into the cover of a nearby alcove. "We can't stay here," Max said, his voice strained. "They'll surround us." Alara's heart raced as she saw the determination in his eyes. Despite the danger, Max remained calm, his every move calculated to keep her safe. For a moment, the chaos around them seemed to fade, and all she could focus on was the man standing between her and the incoming fire. "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice firm despite the fear in her chest. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Max glanced at her, a flicker of emotion passing through his eyes. "I'm getting you out of here, Alara. I made a promise." He fired another volley of shots, disabling the guards who had taken position at the far end of the corridor. The momentary lull in the fight gave them the chance they needed. Max grabbed her hand, pulling her out of the alcove as they sprinted toward the hangar doors. As they burst into the hangar, the open expanse of the spaceport lay before them. Max's team had already taken control of the area, their ship, a sleek, stealthy Nebula Hawk, primed and ready for takeoff. But behind them, the sound of alarms blaring throughout the Citadel meant one thing: their time was running out. "Hurry!" one of Max's men shouted from the ship's ramp, motioning for them to board. Max tightened his grip on Alara's hand, pulling her forward with renewed urgency. They raced across the hangar, the sound of approaching footsteps growing louder by the second. Just as they reached the ramp, a blast rocked the hangar, sending them both sprawling to the ground. Alara cried out as she hit the cold floor, clutching her stomach protectively. Max was beside her in an instant, helping her to her feet as the ship's engines roared to life. "They've activated the autocannons," one of the soldiers shouted, his voice drowned out by the cacophony of explosions. Max gritted his teeth, shielding Alara with his body as they ran up the ramp. "We're getting out of here now." The Nebula Hawk lifted off the ground, the powerful engines propelling them upward, just as a squad of Thalian soldiers burst into the hangar. Shots rang out, but it was too late. The ship had already launched into the sky, breaking free from the Citadel's grip. Inside the safety of the ship, Alara collapsed into a seat, her body trembling from the adrenaline and exhaustion. Max knelt beside her, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you okay? Is the baby?" "I'm fine," Alara whispered, her breath shaky. "We're both fine." Max's shoulders sagged with relief as he leaned back, the weight of their escape finally settling in. They had made it. Barely. But as he looked at Alara, the woman he had risked everything for, he knew that no matter the cost, it had all been worth it. "We're not safe yet," Max said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "But we're together. And I swear, Alara, I'll protect you and our child with everything I have." Alara reached for his hand, her heart swelling with emotion. "I know you will, Max. I know." And as the Nebula Hawk soared into the star-filled sky, leaving the darkness of the Citadel far behind, a new chapter of their lives began. One filled with danger, uncertainty, but also hope. They had defied an empire, but more importantly, they had defied the odds. Together, they would face whatever came next. The Nebula Hawk tore through the starlit skies of the Thalian system, pushing its engines to their absolute limits. Inside, the tense silence was broken only by the hum of the ship's systems and the occasional ping of the sensor array as it tracked the pursuing forces. Max sat at the controls, his jaw clenched, eyes focused on the readouts. Behind them, the Empire's ships were closing in fast. In the passenger cabin, Alara rested in a seat, her breath steadying as she tried to regain her strength. Though her body ached from the strain of their escape, her mind was racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. She glanced out the viewport, watching the stars blur as they sped through space. Every second they stayed alive was a small victory, but the Thalian fleet was relentless. "Can we outrun them?" she asked, her voice calm despite the tension. Max didn't turn from the controls, his voice low and focused. "We're trying, but they've deployed interceptors. They'll cut us off before we reach hyperspace unless we lose them now." Alara's heart sank. She had known it wouldn't be easy, but the reality of being hunted by her own people still weighed heavily on her. They had barely escaped the Citadel, and now the full force of the Empire was bearing down on them. The thought of being recaptured, of what might happen to her child, sent a chill through her. Max glanced back at her, catching the worry in her eyes. "We'll make it," he said, his voice carrying a quiet determination. "I promise." Before Alara could respond, the ship lurched violently as a blast rocked the hull. The alarms blared, red lights flashing as a barrage of plasma fire struck the Nebula Hawk's rear shields. Max tightened his grip on the controls, maneuvering the ship through a narrow asteroid field that loomed ahead. "Hang on," he shouted, pulling the ship into a sharp dive as more enemy fire streaked past them. The asteroid field was dense, a chaotic mass of spinning rocks and debris. Max's only hope was to lose the Thalian ships in the asteroid belt's labyrinthine paths. He weaved through the rocks with precision, narrowly avoiding collisions as the pursuing ships followed, their weapons firing relentlessly. Alara clutched her seat, feeling the weight of the G-forces as the ship spun and dodged through the maze of asteroids. The baby shifted inside her, and she placed a hand on her stomach, whispering soothing words, even as her heart raced. "They're still on us," one of Max's team members called from the co-pilot's seat, scanning the sensors. "We're not shaking them." Max's mind raced. They were running out of options, and the Nebula Hawk's shields wouldn't hold much longer. If they didn't lose the Thalians now, they'd be overwhelmed in minutes. Then, an idea sparked in his mind. Dangerous, but it was all they had. "There's a gravity well forming up ahead," Max said, adjusting the ship's trajectory. "We're going to ride the edge of it." His co-pilot's eyes widened. "You're insane. We'll get crushed by the gravitational pull." Max shook his head, determination setting in. "Not if we stay on the event horizon. The gravitational distortion will mess with their targeting systems, but we need to hit it perfectly." Alara's breath caught in her throat as she heard the plan. Gravity wells were notoriously dangerous, cosmic anomalies that could tear ships apart if they got too close. But the alternative was certain capture or death. "I trust you, Max," she said quietly, knowing full well the risk they were taking. Max's grip on the controls tightened as he adjusted their course. The gravity well appeared on the ship's sensors, a massive swirling distortion in the fabric of space. It was a treacherous gamble, but if they could ride the edge without being pulled in, they might just evade the Thullian ships. The Nebula Hawk's engines roared as they raced toward the anomaly. The ship shuddered under the intense gravitational forces as they approached the event horizon, the stars warping around them. Alara could feel the pull, the weight of the gravity pressing down on her, making it harder to breathe. She gripped her seat, her heart pounding. The pursuing Thullian ships followed closely, but as Max had predicted, their targeting systems faltered in the intense gravitational field. The first Thullian cruiser veered too close, its hull groaning under the pressure before it was yanked into the well, torn apart by the immense forces. Max kept his focus sharp, guiding the Nebula Hawk through the narrow path along the edge of the well. The ship groaned under the strain, but Max held steady, his hands steady on the controls. Another Thullian ship lost control, spinning out of the chase as it was caught in the gravity well's pull. "They're falling back," the co-pilot shouted, excitement in his voice. "We're losing them." Max didn't relax until the last of the pursuing ships broke off, retreating from the deadly anomaly. Once they were clear, he pulled the ship away from the well's influence, punching in the coordinates for their hyperspace jump. "We're clear," Max said, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He glanced back at Alara, relief flooding his expression. "We did it." Alara smiled, though her body was still trembling from the ordeal. "I never doubted you," she said softly, her eyes filled with gratitude. Max gave her a small, tired smile. "Let's get somewhere safe." With a flick of a switch, the Nebula Hawk's engines powered up, and moments later, the ship jumped into hyperspace, leaving the chaos of the asteroid field and the gravity well behind. After what felt like hours of tense travel through hyperspace, the Nebula Hawk finally dropped out of its warp. Before them lay the distant, isolated world of Haven's Reach, a small neutral planet known only to a few. It was a place where fugitives and those seeking refuge could hide from the prying eyes of the galaxy's warring factions. The ship descended through the planet's atmosphere, its engines purring softly as it landed in a dense forest clearing, hidden from the main trade routes and populated areas. As the landing gear touched down, the tension in the air seemed to lift, if only for a moment. "We should be safe here for a while," Max said, powering down the ship's systems. "Haven's Reach doesn't align with any of the major governments. It's off the grid." Alara exhaled slowly, her hand resting on her belly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything. I know you've risked your life to get me this far." Max looked at her, his eyes filled with warmth and concern. "I'd do it 1,000 times over, Alara. You and your child mean everything to me." His words hung in the air between them, a quiet confession of the feelings he had kept hidden for so long. Alara's heart swelled, her emotions a whirlwind of gratitude, affection, and something deeper. Despite the danger, despite the odds stacked against them, Max had been her protector, her anchor. "We'll rest here for a few days," Max continued, breaking the silence. "Give you time to recover. After that, we'll need to plan our next move. The Thullians won't stop searching." Alara nodded, though a sense of unease crept into her thoughts. Even on a neutral planet, they couldn't stay hidden forever. Sooner or later, the Thullian Empire would catch wind of their location, and with her father's reach extending across the galaxy, there would always be someone willing to betray them for the right price. As the crew disembarked, Max led Alara out of the ship and into the fresh, cool air of the forest. The planet was serene, its landscape dotted with towering trees and flowing rivers, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile halls of the Citadel. For the first time in weeks, Alara felt a small measure of peace. They set up a temporary camp near the ship, Max ensuring that their location was secure. The rest of the crew went about gathering supplies and preparing for the days ahead, but Max stayed close to Alara, his watchful eyes never leaving her. Later that night, as the campfire crackled softly and the stars above twinkled in the clear sky, Alara and Max sat together, their thoughts heavy with the weight of the journey ahead. "Alara," Max said quietly, his voice gentle, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." Alara turned to him, her heart fluttering in her chest as she met his gaze. "What is it?" Max hesitated for a moment, his usually steady demeanor faltering. "I've risked everything to save you, because I care about you. But it's more than that. I love you, Alara. I have for a long time. I need you to know that." Alara's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening at his confession. She had always sensed something deeper between them, but hearing him say the words filled her with an overwhelming sense of warmth and love. "I love you too, Max," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know how I would have survived this without you." Max reached for her hand, holding it tightly in his. "Then let me protect you. Always. You and our child." Tears welled in Alara's eyes as she nodded, her heart filled with certainty. "Yes, I want that." They sat together in the quiet night, the fire casting soft, flickering light over them as they held each other close. For the first time since their escape, Alara felt a sense of hope. No matter what the galaxy threw at them, they would face it together. As the night deepened, they spoke of the future, of building a life together, of raising their child in a galaxy that didn't yet understand the power of love. But they would fight for that future, side by side, no matter the cost. The peace of Haven's Reach was short-lived. In the early hours of the morning, as the camp was still and quiet, Max awoke to the shrill alarm from the Nebula Hawk's onboard systems. His heart sank instantly. The proximity alert was blaring. The Thalians had found them. Max bolted from his tent and raced to the ship's cockpit, where the screens displayed the terrifying truth. A small fleet of Thalian ships had entered Haven's atmosphere. They were coming, and they weren't far. He stormed out of the cockpit, his eyes sharp as he called to his crew. "We've been found. We need to move now." Alara emerged from her tent, her face pale but composed. The baby had kept her restless through the night, and now with the reality of their impending danger, she felt a rush of fear for her child's safety. But she knew Max wouldn't let anything happen to them. "How did they find us?" one of the crew members asked, scrambling to pack the supplies. "Doesn't matter," Max said, already making his way to Alara's side. "They're here, and we need to go." Without hesitation, he took Alara's hand, guiding her toward the Nebula Hawk. His mind raced as he calculated their chances. The Thalians weren't here to negotiate. They were here to capture or kill. The fact that they had come this far, to such an isolated planet, meant they were growing desperate. "We'll never outrun them in this condition," Alara said, her voice steady despite the danger. "Max, we can't keep running forever." Max stopped for a brief moment and turned to her, his gaze filled with determination. "We don't have a choice. I'm not losing you." Before Alara could respond, the roar of approaching engines filled the sky. The first Thalian interceptors came into view, cutting through the trees like silver knives. Max's crew, already aboard the ship, powered up the engines, but they were outnumbered. "Max!" one of the crew shouted from the ship's hatch. "We need to lift off now." Max turned back to Alara, his heart pounding. He could see the doubt in her eyes, the weight of their constant flight. But he also saw her resolve, the fire that had drawn him to her in the first place. "We'll find a way," he said softly, squeezing her hand. "I promise." They hurried aboard the Nebula Hawk, the engines roaring to life as the ship lifted off the ground. But the Thalian interceptors were already closing in, and Max knew that a simple escape wouldn't be enough. They needed to outmaneuver their attackers, or they would be shot down before they could even break Haven's atmosphere. As the ship rose higher, Max took the pilot's seat, his fingers flying over the controls. He could feel Alara's presence behind him, steady and calm despite everything they had been through. She trusted him completely, and that trust gave him the strength to push beyond the fear. The Thalian interceptors opened fire, their plasma cannons lighting up the sky with deadly precision. Max veered the Nebula Hawk hard to the left, dodging the first barrage of fire, but the enemy ships were relentless, their weapons cutting through the air with frightening accuracy. "I can't shake them," Max growled, his teeth gritted in frustration. "They're too fast." Alara moved to the co-pilot's seat, her eyes scanning the navigational charts. "There's a meteor shower moving through the system. If we can reach it, the debris will be thick enough to disrupt their scanners." Max glanced at her, his heart swelling with admiration. Even in the face of danger, she was thinking ahead, planning their survival. "Good call," he said, punching in the coordinates. "Hold on." The Nebula Hawk shot forward, its engines burning at maximum capacity as they raced toward the meteor field. Behind them, the Thalian interceptors followed, their weapons continuing to fire, but Max's evasive maneuvers kept them just out of range. As they neared the edge of the meteor field, Max braced himself. The dense cloud of space debris was dangerous. One wrong move and they could be torn apart by a stray asteroid. But if they didn't take the risk, they wouldn't survive. "Here we go," Max shouted, pulling the ship into a steep dive as they entered the meteor field. The Thalian ships followed, but the moment they entered the field, their pursuit faltered. The asteroids came thick and fast, tumbling through space with deadly momentum. Max maneuvered the Nebula Hawk with precision, weaving between the rocks, but the enemy ships struggled to keep up. One by one, the interceptors were struck by the meteors, their hulls crumpling under the impact. "We're losing them," Alara said, her voice filled with hope. Max grinned, his hands steady on the controls. "I told you, we're not going down that easily." Within minutes, the last of the Thalian ships had broken off the chase, retreating from the chaotic debris field. Max guided the Nebula Hawk safely through the meteor shower, his heart pounding with relief as they finally broke free into open space. For the first time in what felt like days, the galaxy stretched out before them in peaceful silence. "We did it," Alara whispered, her eyes shining with gratitude as she looked at Max. Max turned to her, his expression softening. "I told you I'd keep you safe." Alara smiled, her heart full. She reached out, placing her hand over his. "And I never doubted you." With the Thalian interceptors behind them, Max set a course for the distant system of Vadran, where a network of human-friendly outposts existed on the fringes of the galaxy. It would be a safe place to regroup, to plan their next steps. But even as they flew toward safety, Alara felt a growing weight in her chest. She knew their escape was only temporary. The Thalian Empire would never stop hunting them, not as long as she and her child lived. They spent the next few hours in relative calm, the adrenaline of the chase finally wearing off. Alara rested in the ship's quiet medical bay, her mind swirling with thoughts of the future. The baby kicked softly, a reminder of the life growing inside her, and with it came the sobering realization of the world her child would be born into, a galaxy divided by war, prejudice, and hate. Max entered the room, his expression concerned but tender as he sat beside her. "How are you feeling?" Alara smiled faintly. "Tired, but relieved." Max took her hand in his eyes softening as he looked at her. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low, "about what you said earlier, about how we can't keep running." Alara's brow furrowed. "Max, No, you're right," he interrupted gently. "We can't keep doing this. We need to find a way to stop them once and for all, and I think it's time we confront the Empire." Alara's heart skipped a beat. "What are you saying?" Max leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "Your father won't stop hunting us. The Empire won't stop until they have you or the child. But if we can get the message out, if we can show the galaxy that there's a future where humans and Thalians can coexist, then maybe we can turn the tide. Maybe we can stop this war before it tears everything apart." Alara's eyes widened. "You think the galaxy would listen? That they would accept this child?" Max's expression softened as he placed his hand over her stomach, feeling the faint kick of their unborn child. "I think this child represents something bigger than either of us. They're proof that love can transcend all the hate and fear that's been festering between our species for so long." Alara's heart swelled with emotion. She had always known, deep down, that her relationship with a human, her love for Daniel, and now Max, was a symbol of something greater. But to hear Max speak of their child as a beacon of hope for the galaxy filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in so long. "So, what do we do?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "We take the fight to them," Max said, his eyes blazing with determination. "We make a stand. We reach out to our allies. We rally those who believe in what we're fighting for, and we force the Empire to see that their way, this hatred and fear, can't last forever." Alara nodded slowly, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and hope. "It's dangerous." Max smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's always been dangerous, but this is our only chance to build a future for our child, A future where they don't have to live in fear. Alara took a deep breath, her gaze locking onto his. Then I'm with you, whatever it takes. Max squeezed her hand, his heart swelling with pride and love. I've always known you were braver than me. Alara laughed softly, the sound a rare comfort in the midst of all the chaos. You're the one who stormed a citadel for me, remember? Max chuckled, but his smile was filled with warmth as he pulled her into his arms. I'd do it again in a heartbeat. And as they sat together in the quiet of the Nebula Hawk, the stars stretching out before them, Alara knew that no matter what lay ahead, no matter the battles they still had to fight, they would face it together, side by side. They were no longer just fugitives on the run. They were a force for change, a beacon of hope in a galaxy torn by division. And together, with their child as the symbol of a new beginning, they would fight for a future where love and unity could triumph over hate. The Nebula Hawk soared through hyperspace, its destination the outer fringes of the Tetraxis system, where a coalition of sympathetic human and Thalian factions had begun to gather. As the stars streaked by, the ship hummed with a quiet intensity. Max and Alara were no longer just fugitives. They were symbols of defiance, a beacon of hope in a galaxy that desperately needed it. Max sat in the cockpit, his mind racing. The conversation with Alara had solidified his plan. They couldn't keep running forever. If they were going to survive, and more importantly, if their child was going to have a future, they needed to confront the Empire. The galaxy needed to see that Alara and their unborn child weren't an aberration to be hidden, but a promise of a future where humanity and Thalians could coexist. Alara rested in the small medical bay, her hands gently caressing her rounded belly. She could feel the life growing inside her, strong and resilient despite the chaos surrounding them. Her child's presence gave her hope and courage, but she also knew the gravity of what lay ahead. This was no longer just about survival. It was about making a stand, challenging the very foundations of the empire she had once served. We're approaching Tetraxis, Max called out, as the ship dropped out of hyperspace. We should be safe here for a bit. Alara joined him in the cockpit, her expression calm but resolute. As the planet came into view, a flicker of hope ignited in her chest. Tetraxis was a neutral world, known for its independent governance and fierce resistance to imperial control. It was the perfect place to rally their allies and make their message known to the galaxy. The Nebula Hawk touched down in a secluded landing bay on the outskirts of the capital city. Max and Alara stepped out into the cool evening air, the weight of their mission pressing down on them. They were met by a small group of human and Thalian rebels, led by a woman named Commander Ryla, a former Thalian military officer who had defected to the rebellion years ago. Max Ryland, Ryla greeted, her eyes sharp as she appraised them. We've heard the stories. We weren't sure if you'd make it this far. Max shook her hand firmly. We're not here to hide. We're here to make a stand. Ryla's gaze shifted to Alara, her expression softening with recognition. Princess Alara, you're risking everything by being here. The Thalian Empire is hunting you. I know, Alara said, her voice steady. But this isn't just about me anymore. The galaxy needs to see that there's another way. A way where humans and Thalians aren't enemies. Ryla nodded, her respect evident. You've come to the right place. There are many here who believe in that future. But it won't be easy. Your father's influence reaches far, and the Empire will stop at nothing to silence you. Max's jaw clenched at the mention of Alara's father, King Valoron. We're ready for whatever comes. The following hours were spent in strategy meetings with Ryla and other key leaders of the rebellion. It was decided that Alara's message, a call for unity and peace, would be broadcast across the galaxy, an undeniable declaration that would challenge the Empire's narrative. They would reveal the truth of her imprisonment, her love for humanity, and the existence of her unborn child as proof that their two species could come together. But there was an unspoken understanding in the room. Once the broadcast went live, the Empire would respond with force. The following night, under the cover of darkness, Max and Alara stood in a small, makeshift studio deep within the rebel base. A hollow camera was set up in front of them, ready to capture Alara's message to the galaxy. This was it, the moment that would either ignite a revolution or lead to their destruction. Alara took a deep breath. her hand resting on her belly as she prepared to speak. Max stood by her side, his presence a steady, calming force. He had always believed in her, always trusted her strength, and now, as they stood on the precipice of something greater than themselves, she felt that strength surge within her. The camera light blinked on. "People of the galaxy," Alara began, her voice clear and unwavering. "I am Princess Alara of the Thalian Empire. For too long, our people have been divided by fear, by hatred, and by lies. But I stand before you today to say that there is another way." She paused, her eyes burning with conviction as she continued. "I have been imprisoned, tortured, and hunted because I dared to love a human. And now I carry his child, a child that represents a future where our two species can live in peace. The Empire would have you believe that this is impossible, that our differences are too great. But I am living proof that love can transcend those boundaries." Alara's words hung in the air, her message raw and powerful. "I call on all of you, humans, Thalians, and every being across the galaxy, to stand with us. Together, we can create a future where our children don't have to grow up in a galaxy defined by war and fear. We can end this cycle of hatred, but we must stand united." Max's chest swelled with pride as he watched her speak. This was more than just a speech. This was the birth of a movement. The transmission ended, and the room fell silent. The broadcast had gone out across multiple channels, reaching every corner of the galaxy. Now, all they could do was wait. The response was swift. Within hours of the broadcast, the galaxy was alight with reactions. Some hailed Alara as a hero, a symbol of hope in a fractured galaxy. Others denounced her as a traitor, a threat to the purity of the Thalian Empire. But the most immediate response came from the Empire itself. The Thalian fleet arrived above Tetraxis, their ships casting long shadows over the planet's surface. King Valoron's forces were here to crush the rebellion and silence Alara once and for all. The rebel base was on high alert, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Max stood at the command center, his eyes glued to the holoscreen displaying the fleet's movements. "They're coming for us," he said, his voice tense. "We need to be ready." Ryla nodded, her expression grim. "We'll hold them off as long as we can, but they're coming in full force." Alara entered the room, her face calm despite the danger looming overhead. "This is what we prepared for. We knew they would come." Max turned to her, his heart aching with the weight of what was about to happen. "Alara, if things go wrong—" "They won't," she said firmly, stepping closer to him. "We've come too far to lose now." The ground shook as the first blasts from the Thalian ships struck the planet's surface. The battle had begun. Rebel fighters scrambled to their ships, launching into the sky to meet the Empire's forces head-on. The skies above Tetraxis became a chaotic blur of laser fire and explosions, the clash of rebellion and Empire echoing across the land. Max led a squad of fighters into the fray, his ship dancing through the battle with the same precision that had saved them so many times before. He couldn't let them fail. Not now. Back on the ground, Alara remained at the command center, coordinating with the rebel forces. Every decision weighed heavily on her, but she refused to waver. The future of her child, of the entire galaxy, depended on their success. Hours passed, the battle raging with no clear victor. But slowly, the tide began to turn. More and more rebel ships filled the sky, their numbers bolstered by sympathizers from across the galaxy who had heard Alara's message and come to fight. And then, in a moment that felt like destiny, the Imperial flagship, where King Valoron himself commanded the attack, was struck by a barrage of rebel fire. The ship faltered, its engines crippled. The Empire's forces began to retreat, their resolve broken. The rebels cheered as the remaining Thalian ships fled into hyperspace, leaving Tetraxis free. Max returned to the base, his heart pounding with the adrenaline of victory. He found Alara standing in the command center, her face filled with quiet relief. "We did it," he said, pulling her into his arms. Alara smiled, resting her head against his chest. "We did." But the victory was bittersweet. Though they had won the battle, they knew the war was far from over. The Empire would not forget this day, and King Valoron's rage would only grow. But for now, they had hope. Hope that the message of unity and love would spread, that their child would be born into a galaxy that was slowly learning to heal. Max kissed Alara's forehead, his voice soft and filled with love. "We'll face whatever comes next, together." Alara looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears. I wouldn't want it any other way. As the stars stretched out before them, Max and Alara knew they had begun something that would change the galaxy forever. They were no longer fugitives or rebels. They were the foundation of a new future. And as they stood hand in hand, their child nestled safely within Alara, they looked out at the universe with hope, ready to face whatever came next. Together,